So for our second session this morning, it's going to be more Hestia focused, not Hestia focused on archetypal psychology per se, and the myths that back archetypal psychology. So our first speaker is Dr. Gustavo Beck. And also welcome back, Gustavo. And we're very, where's Gustavo? Gustavo, as you know, lives in Mexico City. So he had a recent encounter with the underworld. And we're so happy that you and your family and those around you are safe. Yeah. Gustavo is professor of psychology at the Universidad Iberoamerica. I love these language, you know. And but the more interesting work in many ways sounds like it's your work with the Instituto de Psicología Profunda. Why can't we do that? The Instituto Profunda. Beautiful, yes. Which is really devoted to archetypal Jungian psychology. He is very carefully, over a long period of time, working on his Ph.D. dissertation at the Pacifica Institute, and it's an in-depth reading of revisioning psychology, James Hillman's revisioning psychology. So it's going to be a revisioning psychology squared. Yeah, that's going to be something. We'll hear something of this work this morning in his talk. It's based on James Hillman's chapter, Oedipus Revisited.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you all. Thank you for the invitation. Thanks for hosting. And I do want to say that I'm really grateful to be part of this panel, to be following these presentations. I was not only moved, but I was reminded of why, as a psychologist, I moved into mythology in the first place, and that's important. So my paper is inspired on Antigone, on Sophocles' tragedy. I kind of touch on it, but I don't know if I'm going to do it justice. It's titled Living with the Dead, the psychological methodology of death, myth, and burial. So this story travels backwards, and it moves on 3 tracks: the theoretical, the mythical, and the personal. Let me then initiate with 3 conclusions. First, the theoretical one. The essence of James Hillman's work can be found in his explorations surrounding the images and themes of death. Second, the mythical conclusion of Sophocles' Antigone. The daughter of Oedipus kills herself after committing to performing the proper burial rituals for her brother Polynices. And finally, and I hope this is not too much self-disclosure, the personal conclusion to my Friday night yesterday. Last night, Pat Berry asked me how fatherhood was going. My son was born 10 months ago. My reply was somewhat clumsy, but her question kept me thinking. And later, last night, my wife and my mother-in-law went to run some errands, and I was left with my son, who was asleep. But like 15 minutes into it, woke up and started crying. I picked him up, and a few minutes later, I found myself crying just as intensely as he was. So these are the 3 concluding images that start my paper: death, suicide for burial, and a crying father with his son in his arms. Let me work through these as best as I can. So this is part 1. Hillman's Oedipus, myth as method. So if I begin with death, it is easier to ask the necessary question. Why myth? This seems to be the fundamental issue. When I tell my colleagues at the Universidad Iberoamericana that I have a doctorate in mythological studies, the response tends to be very confused expression, which ranges from a playful curiosity to harsh disdain. They simply do not get it, or at least most do not. The Freudians do get it, I think, but they never want to get it to my face or in front of other Freudians. The Kleinians do want to get it and are open to conversing about it. The Lacanians do get it, but they get it so much so that many are sure that they get my interest in mythology better than I do and are quite eager to correct me. The neuroscientists, curiously enough, sometimes get it, and the behaviorists obviously never get it. And then there is, of course, the Jungians and the post-Jungians, who absolutely get it, or so they say. Although I must say that many times when they speak of myth, they might as well be speaking about quantum physics, accounting spreadsheets, or Japanese feudalism. They are speaking to me in a different language. It certainly does not resonate. It doesn't feel like I have been gotten. In this case, the problem is not so much which language is right and which one is wrong. What is bothersome is the assumption that because one is Jungian or post-Jungian, one relates to myth in the same way as other Jungians and post-Jungians do. After all, it was Hillman himself who said, and this is a quote, that a fundamental tenet of archetypal psychology is the interchangeability of mythology and psychology. Mythology, he says, is a psychology of antiquity. Psychology is a mythology of modernity. So yes, this is a beautiful and rather eloquent fundamental tenet. It is one of my favorite quotes of Hillman, in fact, probably the one that ignited my desire to become an archetypal psychologist. But it is not enough. We need more particularity. And here is where it becomes useful to resort to Oedipus Revisited, in order to ground Hillman's bridging of psychology and mythology, and perhaps expand from there. It is in this essay, I believe, where Hillman most poignantly articulates the intertwining of mythical tellings and depth psychological theory. In his revision of psychoanalysis, he utilizes Freud's core metaphor, Oedipus, as a tool that helps the reader understand the inner workings of psychoanalytic theory, which thus becomes psychoanalytic fantasy or psychoanalytic myth. This simultaneously deliteralizes the content of Freud's massive ideational edifice and situates it in a much deeper, much more psychological topos, the mythological landscape of Cythera and Thebes. Once there, he magnificently explores the Oedipal themes: in-betweenness, blindness, allegiance to Apollonic oracles, insistence on solving riddles, and of constructing life in terms of riddles, and the relationship with psychological theory. Depth psychologically is, according to Hillman, a myth, and as such, and this is another quote, is obliged to notice its fantasy in reading its theories. So this allows Hillman to get away with somewhat outlandish but very acute claims. In the section of his essay subtitled Family as Fate, he speaks about Freud's detractors. He states, rather beautifully I think, "Of course Freud got it wrong, but I am not joining with his critics. Freud got it wrong because it is the genius of psychology to get it wrong, to disturb, pervert, dislocate, misread, so as to lift the repression of the usual sense. Psychoanalysis goes wrong in order to keep close to the wrongness in the case, whatever the case may be. Pathologizing is homeopathic, like cures like. There must be madness in the method if the method would reach the madness." That is Hillman at its absolute best, I think. Psychoanalysis is then blind about its blindness. And this is the case because blindness is part of the psychoanalytic fantasy. Hillman's brilliance, however, does not rest in pointing out such blindness or its inevitability. Rather, it is to be found in Hillman's underlying proposition that this blindness is not wrong, it is necessary. Or rather, that the blindness is wrong, but that there is virtue in wrongness and vision in blindness. As part of the story, blindness is required in order to move the narrative forward. And that is what Hillman does. He follows the narrative. He moves with the story, and he ends up with Oedipus and Antigone in Colonus. There, Hillman lets blind Oedipus die, but he knows well that Depp's psychological story is far from over. In Hillman's view, entering Colonus implies descending into anima territory. This, Hillman says, quote, moves the mind from seeing to hearing, moves questioning from what happened to where are we now, moves family from parents to children, and moves children from duty to love. It moves saving the city by action to blessing the city by death. And all these moves, he says, suggest another one from Freud to Jung. Of course, my underlying premise here is that I'm trying to move from Jung to Hillman. Hillman, however, is not rejecting Freud. He is merely pushing Freud's story forward. He is, in his words, remythologizing it, or in Pat's words, restating it, as one does with dreams and images. We have been misled, Hillman says, by the intentional fallacy, misled into reading Freud according to his intentions. And here, where Freud is read by intentions other than Freud's, Oedipus is free to die in Colonus, with one crucial consequence for us. In Colonus, anima and images are the method. Previously, Hillman had already told us that the Greek word for road, previously in the essay, of course, is hodos, from which our method, metahodos, derives. A method is then simply the pursuit of a particular path, and it is there where myth is crucial, for myth shows the path. It is curious to see, for instance, who Hillman tells us to follow. In Colonus, he says, quote, anima takes the lead in the person of Antigone, who provides the hodos. So we are then to follow Antigone, who after her father dies, who after her father's death goes back to Thebes, where she will face war, a divided family, her brothers killing each other, and an inflated uncle. It is curious to see that in the story, after accompanying her father to die, the next mission, the next path, or the next hodos, or the next method for Antigone is to bury the brother that her uncle refuses to bury, a path that would lead her knowingly to death. Part 2, Antigone's suicide mission, death as method. So it is not difficult to notice that the theme of death is present all through Hillman's work. The first book he published after his doctoral dissertation, after all, was on suicide. He actually starts that book, Suicide and the Soul, by stating that any careful consideration of life entails reflections of death, and the confrontation with reality means facing mortality. Imagine, like, from all Hillman, that's the first sentence in Hillman's work. That's so amazing. Furthermore, a decade later, he wrote an entire volume on dreams based on the mythology of the underworld. For Hillman, soul-making is meant, quote, to hew and bevel the ship of death, the vessel of death, a container for holding the dying that goes on in the soul. He's making reference there to a D.H. Lawrence poem. In Revisioning Psychology, he says that the significance soul makes possible, whether in love or in religious concern, derives from its special relation with death. He goes as far as saying that, quote, to be human is to be constantly reminded of death and to have a perspective informed by death. To be human is to be soul-focused, is what Hillman says. And this means to be death-focused. These are Hillman's words. Hillman describes our urge to psychologize as a phenomenon akin to, quote, to what Freud calls the death drive and what Plato presented as the desire for Hades. This urge, he says, works to destruction, the dissolving, decomposing, detaching, and disintegrating processes necessary to both alchemical psychologizing and to modern psychoanalyzing. This is my second proposition, that death is a psychological method par excellence. As psychologists, in the Hillmanian sense, what we do is let phenomena dissolve, decompose, and fall apart in order for them to release their psychological value. This death, and this is why myth is important, is not a mere action. We are not exclusively in the Laius Oedipus fantasy anymore. It is rather something we allow to happen, something for which we provide the space. We are more undertakers than murderers. In this, we are like Antigone. Her method is our method. Our allegiance is always to the gods, particularly to the chthonic gods, to the gods of the underworld. Antigone's loyalty to tradition and to the gods of death is quite radical. To her sister, she says, this is Antigone speaking, "Do as you like, whatever suits you best. I will bury him myself," speaking about her brother. "And even if I die in the act, the death will be a glory. I will lie with the one I love and loved by him, an outrage sacred to the gods. I have longer to please the dead than please the living here. In the kingdom down below, I'll lie forever. Do as you like, dishonor the laws the gods hold in honor." And then with Creon, her uncle, she speaks even more forcibly. She says, "Nor did I think your edict had such force that you, a mere mortal, could override the gods, the great unwritten, unshakable traditions. They are alive, not just today or yesterday. They live forever from the first time, and no one knows when they first saw the light." And she carries on and tells him, "So for me at least, to meet this doom of yours," that is the sentencing her to be buried alive, "is precious little pain. But if I had allowed my mother's son to rot, an unburied corpse, that would have been an agony. This is nothing. And if my present actions strike you as foolish, let's just say I've been accused of folly by a fool." My proposition is that Antigone is to Hillman what Oedipus was to Freud, by the way. My proposition is thus very simple. When Hillman says that soul is a rude metaphor of his psychology, it is possible to understand this to mean that death is a rude metaphor of his psychology, or perhaps even of psychology as a field, be it in the form of infanticide, parricide, fratricide, or suicide. But here is where I want to emulate the master, in that it is not only about the action of killing, it is not about generating death, and it is not about, so to speak, it is not about the side of parricide or suicide. It is about the experience of dying. It is about making space for death. It is about letting it happen, about feeling it and allowing it to act on its own. This is why corpses must be buried, so they decompose properly and release their nutrients and their richness to the ground below us. This is what myths do. Myths are tombs. They provide the space for death and thus make psychological experience possible. And with this, I move to the more personal thread of my text. Part 3. Soul is nothing. Burial as method. And the thing is, what does this have to do with my son and I crying in the middle of the darkness? I'll get back to that, but first let me do a recount of my previous appearances in this symposium, standing right here in this podium. A few years ago, when I stood here for the first time to speak about archetypal psychology as a city and the soul's body politic, I framed my talk as a frontal backstabbing to James Hillman, a backstabbing that was also, in my own words, a quote, professional suicide. Next year, that was 2 years ago, again in this room, speaking about the Senex poor attention, I introduced my remarks with an image, a raven pecking a corpse which lied just underneath a freshly dug tomb. The presentation was conceived as a eulogy. I actually used that word in my title. I argued that certain ideas from James Hillman's work might be dying from within, going as far as suggesting that we might be facing the death of archetypal psychology. Well, these are my words from back then. So looking back, the image I used in that second paper was quite appropriate. Indeed, I was just pecking. I was pecking with good intention, but not really going deep enough. That year, Saturday evening before leaving, Margot, when she said goodbye to me, told me something that I took to be a challenge. I don't know if it was meant like that, but that was how I experienced it. She said something like, and you can correct me, but she said, "It's great that you can critique James," she said, "but you should push it further and come up with something that belongs to you. I am looking forward to when you do that." So that left me puzzled. And I'm sure I also responded clumsily to that question. But it has also been brewing within me for the past couple of years. What was I to contribute to this community? What is my actual proposal? What is interesting or important about what I am attempting to say? I really sat with this for a long time, and I think I can finally approach the issue with relative poise. What I want to do in the work of James Hillman and in my work as a psychologist is to take the side of death. This might be the reason why my proposition has not been clear for me or for others, because I am, quite simply, proposing nothing. And when I say that I propose nothing, I do not mean that there is no proposal. I mean that my proposal is nothing. Nothing is my proposal. Confusing as this might be, today I wish to actively direct myself towards nothing, towards a nothing that lives within James Hillman's work and within psychology. Lopez Pedraza used to speak about the impossible image. Perhaps it's something like that, what I'm looking for. An image of the invisible, like Hillman proposed in The Dream and the Underworld. Or an image of the imageless, an image of death, which would in turn kill and bury the notion of image as I know it today. And I'm not trying to be clever here, this is important. And for that, allow me to return to my son. As I was attempting fruitlessly to help him to sleep yesterday, as I said, I started crying. Initially, I would say these were the normal tears of a frustrated parent who is tired and overwhelmed with the intensity of everyday life. But then something strange happened. A song came to me. It's an old song. I don't know if you know it, but it's Alice Faye's You'll Never Know. I started singing to my son. And he stopped crying. So I kept on singing, but something even stranger happened, which is that I felt my son's silence. And here, okay. I'm not able to explain it at the moment, but when I felt this silence, I kept humming lightly in the dark with my baby looking at my chin. And the more silent the room was and the darker it felt, the more something was moving inside my chest from where the humming was coming. Finally, something just broke open within me, and I started sobbing, literally sobbing, much like my son was before. And while I cried and sang, he just looked at me and listened. And then I pulled myself back together, and when I did that, he started crying again. And we went back and forth a couple of times. And I'm telling you, those were a couple of very beautiful and intense minutes. So that is the nothing I'm searching for. That is the silence that I want. It is the silence that is heard within the confines of a tomb when someone is about to commit suicide, or the silence of a baby when he hears his father cry. It is not necessarily actual silence. It is not literally nothing. It is a strange image of vacuum that seems to inhabit images and psychological experiences, where strange things happen, where thoughts, feelings, and fantasies come, and then simply exit the stage without too much spectacle. Of course, there is nothing actually similar about Antigone's suicide in my experience yesterday, although I suspect, or maybe just hope, there is. What ripped my chest open when my child fell silent at the sound of my song was the saddest thought I've had in years. The thought was, he'll never know. My son will never know about this moment. Or rather, he will never experience it like I did. He will carry it within him for the rest of his life, but he will never recall the night when his dad was crying like a lunatic, trying to make him sleep, feeling simultaneously terrified and blessed. He will know the story maybe, kind of like I know Antigone, and that will make him feel something, until perhaps one day he experiences that void where songs appear in the darkness without notice. I have been reading, in preparation for this presentation, the Lament of the Dead, the conversation between Hillman and Shamdasani about the Red Book. There they mentioned, not forcefully enough, I would say, that the task of psychology is to listen to the dead. For that we need myth. Myths provide the containers through which we can listen to the dead. And for that we have to bury them. In fact, myths are the place where we bury the dead. That is the only way we can hear their voices properly. Myths divide us with the imaginal and subtle particularity required to enhance our psychological perception. We need myths, and we need the silence within the tomb to be able to listen to the voice of the soul. Hillman told Shamdasani, this is a quote, I think it's more a matter, this is also a wonderful quote, I think it's more a matter of realizing that there is a porous permeability between the living and the dead, between life and death. And it seems to me that this offers a completely different way of realizing that the day world is permeated with the other world in all kinds of small ways, that there are always inner voices, that you are living with the dead. I agree with Hillman. I am fairly certain that he is still speaking, along with the rest of the dead. It is just a matter of tuning in through silence. Yesterday, for instance, I was able to do it for a couple of minutes, and someone gifted me with a beautiful song. Thank you.